Here follows an extract from my book Artful Designs, available from Amazon. Chapter 20, Part 2. Drew and James had agreed to meet back at Drew's house so that they, along with Beth, could talk matters over together. Maddox was to join them once he'd collected his notes. Before that, James planned to take a detour to see Finn in hospital. Finn was perhaps well enough to have gone home, but there was nobody to care for him there. And, of course, he was a suspect in a burglary case which was becoming increasingly alarming. As such, it was thought best to keep him under supervision in all respects at the hospital. It was better than a police cell, at least. When James finally arrived, he found Drew eating his dinner alone in the kitchen. Although that was something of an overstatement, Drew merely pushed the food around his plate, having no appetite to eat. "Where's Beth?" asked James. "She's in her music room. For weeks now she's been reading up on historical art thefts, but since I told her about Sally, she hasn't been able to tear herself away. I'll go and get her now. She won't want to miss anything now you're here." When Drew and Beth returned to the kitchen, Maddox had also arrived. James had made himself busy and 4 mugs were waiting at the kitchen table. Soon each mug found an appropriate owner and discussion could begin. "I think I'll open up the conversation with a few obvious truths," said James. "I refuse to accept my lot and resign myself to the statistic of yet another unsolved art theft. We've 2 murders and an attempted murder to deal with now, and in that regard my record is unblemished. I don't intend for that to change now. If we put our heads together, we can beat this bill, and his luck is about to run out." "I think we all know that this is a 3-horse race," continued James. "The whodunit will soon make itself apparent. I've a feeling that the where is it has always been our biggest problem." "I may be able to help you there," said Beth. "I haven't fully formulated my thoughts and I'm not ready to commit to anything just yet, but I've a hunch that I'm on the right track." "That's very reassuring," said James. "I won't force your hand, but you know I'm relying on your alternative approach to help me out." "Tell of your 3-horse race, Benji," said Drew. "It may seem obvious to you, but I can't imagine anyone doing these things." "I will presently," James replied. "First, I'd like to confirm a hunch of my own by asking Maddox to tell us his findings from the employment records of the Whitworth and Mag." Maddox rolled his eyes at the remembrance of the pages and pages of employment records he'd ploughed through. "I'd never make a historian," he said. "They must spend their whole lives screening reams of paperwork. It's like searching for a needle in the haystack." "Nevertheless, I trust you found a needle," said James. "A few, actually, although I know you'd have preferred just one," said Maddox. "I'll save you the agony of hearing about the whole payroll. Riveting as that might be in itself, it didn't shed any light on our situation. However, the rostrum of friends and students on placement in the general gallery scene was very interesting. Just as you suspected, a few familiar names did crop up. We know that Rick did a placement at Mac during his student days when he was working on his masters. In the year before that, Theo did some voluntary work at the Whitworth, and about 6 months later Conrad Jefferson signed up as a friend to both galleries. Looking at the calendar of the academic year, there is an overlap where all 3 could have been in the same artistic circles for a period of few months. It's highly likely they'd have met." "Jefferson did say that he'd hung around with the so-called cultural set when he was a student. He said he went to private viewings too," said Drew. "And he had a tattoo in exactly the same place as Rick. They must have all met at some point. These arty types are so cliquey," said James. He glanced at Drew and murmured a short apology. "Arty circles always seem to overlap. It's politely referred to as networking, but it's war beneath the veneer as people vie for notice and advancement." "I resent that remark," said Drew. "I'm just glad I studied outside of Manchester. I never did manage to hobnob, but nobody would believe it if my student days overlapped with theirs." You didn't play the game, said James. You're too nice a chap for all that self-advancement, though you've done okay for yourself nevertheless. Besides, as I remember things, you were too absorbed with my twin sister at about that time. Drew and Benji exchanged a smile, remembering the early days of their friendship. Of course, Benji was right, because Beth had been at the heart of all that occupied Drew's thoughts at that time. Once again, I've unwittingly saved you from trouble, said Beth. A despairing sigh from Maddox regained their attention. Those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, said James. I've seen the way you look at Hetty. Don't think you're immune. They all laughed and then turned their minds once more to the unpleasant business in hand. Of course, Rick is now out of the running, and so we have our 3-horse race, said James. Drew and Beth, you'll have to put your personal considerations to one side. I know you're friends with both Theo and Conrad, but you must let the facts speak for themselves. Seeing that they understood him, James continued. We've known from the start that Theo is a prime suspect. But it's destroying him, Drew interrupted. He's devastated. His life's work is in ruins. And although his approach to a relationship with Sally differs greatly from a manner which we would agree with, in his own way he is very fond of Sally. Or rather, he was. You can see in his face that he's a broken man. Nevertheless, he has to be considered. He has unlimited access to all areas of the gallery at all times, said James. Then why bother with all of this fuss, said Drew. Who can tell what goes through a person's mind, said James. Let's take it as read then and move on. What about the other 2 horses, said Beth. The next candidate is obviously Jefferson, said James. I know that Drew and Beth are bewitched by him, but there's more to him than meets the eye. Years in the force have given me a nose for a crook, and Jefferson is one to the core. He also has the means to commit these crimes. He has a finger in every pie, and he's clever enough to help himself. I agree that either of those could be involved in the theft. But murder, said Maddox. Do you honestly think that either of them are capable of murder? Anybody is capable of murder. You don't have to be a policeman to know that. Years of psychology research has shown that. With the right trigger, we're all capable. The threshold for each individual is different and, thank God, the vast majority of us don't get pushed to that point. Fear and the protection of those you hold dear would be enough for any man, but sadly a bit of Constable will do it for another. Or so it would seem, said James. I can see how Theo and Conrad at least had the opportunity for the theft. They both have access to the museum. I can see how Theo and Conrad at least had the opportunity for the theft. They both have access to the museum. I can see how Theo and Conrad at least had the opportunity for the theft. They both have access to the museum. The security footage is at their fingertips, and they both have the brains to orchestrate it to their advantage, said Beth. But who is the third dark horse? James knew in his own mind that he was playing for time, because even he lacked the courage to blatantly accuse Drew's favourite protégé, and so he gave a long preface to his thoughts. For the full book of Artful Designs, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.